Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Miller Center for the sixth and final event in our Election 2024 series, and the first event in our Transition 2025 series, where we'll look at presidential transitions. Presidential transitions are a moment of great hope and opportunity for the country, and also a moment of great peril. The hope and the opportunity is the American people have spoken, and we have not just a new president, but also a new Congress. Both houses of Congress, in this case, have important and major changes going on, as well as the president and his incoming team. And the additional promise is the president gets to pull in a new team, a White House team, as well as a cabinet. The new president gets to identify priorities and then learn to work with Congress or advance those priorities using the authorities of the executive branch. It's also a moment of peril, and we've studied this a great deal at the Miller Center. American history is replete with first-year crises, both political crises and national security crises. Since the Kennedy administration, which we at the center know well and know the presidents well since then, you can just go through all of the first-year crises that have happened. The Bay of Pigs was a first-year crisis. 9/11 was a first-year crisis. And 8 years before that, President Clinton had al-Qaeda attack the Twin Towers as well. President Clinton had another first-year crisis, which was Black Hawk Down. And President Bush had his own series of, Bush 41 had his own series of first-year crises as well. Tiananmen Square, a failed coup in Panama, and then, of course, the fall of the Berlin Wall. And they're particularly perilous as first years because the new team comes in and they don't always know one another. Sometimes they've worked together before, sometimes they haven't, but rarely have they had the positions they've had in the past, and they have to learn to work together as a team as the crises present themselves. So we'll look at all of those issues today, how the president lines up his team, how he lines up his agenda, and how he begins to work with Congress and addresses the challenges in the world. And we have such a terrific group with us today to talk about these things. I'm going to start with Melody Barnes, who's Executive Director of UVA's Karsh Institute of Democracy and also a professor of practice here at the Miller Center. During the Obama administration, Melody was co-director of President Obama's initial transition to office and then went on to serve as assistant to the president and director of the White House Domestic Policy Council. John Harris is co-founder and global editor-in-chief of Politico. He's also a member of the Miller Center's Governing Council, which begins meeting later this afternoon. So we're really delighted to have John here, not just for this panel, but for those discussions. He began his career at the Washington Post, where he covered politics on the local, state, and national levels, including being White House correspondent. He's also the author of The Survivor, Bill Clinton in the White House, and co-author of The Way to Win, Taking the White House in 2008. And then finally, joining us by Zoom is Eric Edelman, who is a practitioner senior fellow with us, as well as counselor at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments. And he is the co-host of the Shield of the Republic podcast, which is produced by the Bulwark in partnership with the Miller Center. He served as ambassador to Turkey and Finland, was Undersecretary of Defense for Policy in the George W. Bush administration, and also served in the Bush White House, working directly for Vice President Cheney as Deputy National Security Advisor. He has served in Moscow as Deputy Chief of Mission and a number of other senior State Department and White House posts in his long and distinguished career. And he's been with us at the Miller Center for much of the last 10 years, including having been the James Schlesinger Distinguished Professor here at the Miller Center. Toward the end of today's conversation, we'll have Q&A with all of you. For those of us joining in person, please use the index cards at your seats. And for those of us online, please send in your questions through the Q&A function, and Alfred Reeves IV will bring me your questions. So let's get started. We're going to start with transition planning and the lessons of history. On the one hand, this president has done it before. On the other hand, it appears to be an entirely new group of people. And the last time around was, let's just say, his first transition into office was a little bit chaotic. He fired his transition director the day after being elected president and did it all on the fly when he arrived. So Eric, through your many years of government service, you've experienced a number of different presidential transitions. What did that teach you about the transition process? What's most important, and what are you looking for as this transition unfolds? Oh, hold on, Eric. Your sound is not.
I'm sorry. Can you hear me now?
Hear you now. Thank you.
Okay. I was just saying that I'm glad to be on this panel with you and John and Melody. Sorry that I can't be there in person. My Foreign Service colleague, Avis Bolin, who is the daughter of Charles Bolin, a legendary American diplomat, used to have an iron law of transitions for the career Foreign Service. Her view was that no matter how much you disliked the previous group of political appointees, the new group always would make you have nostalgia for the previous group. I think that there's an inherent tension in all transitions. The incoming group is always, as the Brits would say, chuffed because they've just won an election. The media is all hailing them for how brilliant they were in the campaign. The losing side has been defeated and tends to be, in the midst of recriminations about how it was that they lost. And the kind of dynamic is that the outgoing team very earnestly wants to help the incoming team. Enormous forests are sacrificed to produce, very large briefing books, which the incoming team, by and large, tends to ignore. And so I was involved in every transition between 1980 and 2009, and I saw this dynamic play out. I would say that, and I'd be, very interested in Melody's view of this because she was on the other side. I do think that the 2009 transition from President Bush 43 to President Obama was one of the smoother ones for a couple of reasons. First, because the Presidential Transition Act had created some new processes that allowed the transition to be smoother. And I think President Bush was very, very conscious of the fact that this was a transition in wartime and he wanted it to go very smoothly. And so I think it was actually one of the better transitions. And my personal transition was, eased by the fact that my successor was Michel Flournoy, a thoroughgoing professional. And I think we had a very smooth transition in OSD. And that was helped, of course, by the fact that Secretary Bob Gates stayed on. One of the things in the current transition that is worrisome to me is that the Trump team has not availed itself essentially of the benefits of the Presidential Transition Act and signed all the various paperwork that would allow that transition to go forward. I mean, in addition to the 5 transitions I lived through, as a government civil servant, I also was one of the 3 co-chairs of the defense transition for then Governor Mitt Romney in 2012. A transition that I think was incredibly professional, and Chris Liddell, for whom I'm substituting today, has actually written quite a good book about that transition. And we did avail ourselves of all of the appurtenances that the Presidential Transition Act allows the putative incoming team to enjoy. In the case of the Romney transition, we obviously didn't win and therefore never got to exercise the transition. But had it happened, we were very, very well prepared, I think. And I anticipate that would have been an equally smooth transition to the 2009 one. Why don't I stop there?
Eric, we'll circle back to you in a bit about how this transition's going, but I will look to Melody quickly and John for some opening remarks. Melody, from your Obama experience, you were in a transition during a financial crisis. After a long, drawn-out campaign, what do you remember about those first few weeks, and what do you think you did right? And looking back on it, what did you learn from the experience?
Great. Well, first of all, it's wonderful to be here with you all. And excuse me, I will start out by saying ditto to what Eric said. That 2008, 2009 transition, from our perspective, went extremely well. The message was sent from the top, and I remember walking to the White House in the summer of 2008 with John Podesta to meet with the Chief of Staff and other members of the senior Bush team, and they made it very clear that they were going to do everything they could to work with us, and they did. And that carried over to the days after the election. You asked about what you remember, and in some ways it's a surreal period. As Eric mentioned, you've just won. There's an excitement and giddiness that comes with that. I had been based in Washington because of my work on the transition in addition to the campaign. So unlike my colleagues who were in Chicago, I was fully prepared for what would come literally the morning after the election. You wake up, you're still feeling pretty happy. It's been a late night, and you're on the phone with GSA, with General Services Administration, immediately preparing for the meetings that will allow you to start, in our case, the agency review process that I was the co-head of. For those who had been in Chicago, they had been on a campaign for almost 2 years, and they had planned vacations. A friend was going to Mexico, and other people going to other places. And John Podesta called in wonderful John Podesta style and said, "No, you're not. You're coming to Washington, and we have to integrate you into the process." I think what we did well was, and this also touches on something that Eric mentioned, and the importance of moving forward with the process. Process is important. Eyes can glaze over, people can think it's boring. It is important. And because we had started the work the summer before, we knew immediately that we wanted to go in with a set of prepared materials to get away from just the big binder that would, prepare personnel, cabinet leaders that were going to be nominated to go into their confirmation hearings, not only to be prepared for that, but to be prepared to go into those departments and agencies with some proficiency and understanding of what they needed to address early on. So we had prepared all of that. We also had been working very closely with the Bush 43 team because of the economic crisis, and there were already conversations underway about substantive policy and close relationship between those two teams to prepare for that, and some of the holdovers into the new Obama administration to make sure that that transition went smoothly, and because the economy was in such dire straits at that moment. And we also had started to prepare for a big stimulus bill and had started to work with Congress very, very quickly and to avail ourselves of the expertise that sat in the civil service. I remember, obviously I'd worked in government for many years. I had interacted with folks at OMB. I still, and it's been how many years? 16 years. When I think about the OMB, the expertise that sits in OMB and the people I encountered in those first few days, a warm and fuzzy feeling washes over me still, because they were so absolutely essential to what we had to put together and had to put together very, very quickly. So personnel, policy, and preparation were the things that I think that we did well, and we did a lot of it working very closely with the Bush 43 folks.
And Eric had mentioned Chris Liddell, who was supposed to be with us today, but was unable to because advice that he's giving to the Trump transition. In his book, which we published at the Miller Center as part of our series on the American presidency, he talks about the value of OMB. It's not often that people are in love with bureaucrats, but this is sort of the epicenter of the federal bureaucracy, and the professionalism of this group in terms of knowing where everything is pretty extraordinary. So John, you've reported on a number of these over the years. Going back 30 years, you're now overseeing a huge team, both in the United States, and Politico is a global operation. So not just people following the transition here at home, but people following it abroad, world leaders. How do you think about this in the context of all the others that you've covered? Give us your take on how we should be thinking about this transition.
Well, sure, and just to start with this one, I've got a responsibility to be unbiased, but it's hard. As a Virginia resident, I'm obviously incredibly proud that we've got an Attorney General nominee who went to the College of William and Mary Law School, right? And so you know, I've got to.
It's careful, John. It's a rival school. You haven't spent enough time in Charlottesville.
But they're both excellent Commonwealth of Virginia
Absolutely.
schools, and you know, obviously a measure of pride in that as a resident of
Absolutely.
Alexandria. Look, there's been so much work, and the process of transitions has been studied in a systematic way, and a body of procedure and precedent, and some of it actually embodied in a law, has been accumulating, right? We were talking earlier, and you mentioned like the Kennedy transition, where actually that process of passing the baton was still quite improvisational, and now it shouldn't be improvisational. There's a body of custom and even law around it, but I think all of that is predicated on a notion of respect, respect for the institutions of government, respect for the enterprise of public service. So I do think it's really, there's no frame of reference for this transition, not even the first Trump transition 8 years ago, because what President Trump represents in his politics is, and I'm really saying this more objectively. I've obviously got normative feelings about it, but like just in objective terms, he practices the politics of contempt. Right? It's explicit. I mentioned like Matt Gaetz. Well, he's putting out well, he wants to. His first act is to eliminate agencies of government, the FBI and others. They're openly practicing a kind of a politics of contempt. That politics of contempt, as President Trump has practiced it over a decade now, obviously strikes very powerful chords within his supporters, and they won in a. They didn't steal the election; they won it clearly, comprehensively, and so they're now bringing that worldview and that politics to it. And it seems to me it's almost kind of antithetical to the notions of like, well, how do you have a smooth transition? It's predicated on respect for what's came before you and what's going to ultimately come after you. And they've made it explicit they don't have that. So they're always, well, he won. Like, how much of this stuff does he really mean? Now that he's got responsibility again, what's he mean? And it's pretty clear, like, he means a lot of it. I don't think that you would have some of those appointments into critical positions with people who, by the conventional or traditional precedents, would not be the kind of people you would turn to at the Department of Defense, the Department of Justice, at the National Intelligence Office. So I have no, I think there's not a great frame of reference for what President Trump is thinking about this transition. The only thing I would say is, like, there does seem to be this interesting division. I don't think it's probably fair to call it tension or conflict, because but the Chief of Staff, Susie Wiles, is like somebody who's is now central to the Trump movement, but doesn't come from within the Trump movement. She comes within Republican circles, where probably in a different time, she might be sitting up here on this very panel talking about, what President-elect Romney would be doing if that had come to pass, or what their responsibilities would be for the administration if she had served in it earlier. What she does represent, it seems to me, from what we read, like a kind of an instinct for order, and that I think she's. I'll channel Trump and what he wants to do, but we'll do it in an orderly way. So in the campaign, you had this dichotomy, like, well, it's actually the most disciplined, most orderly campaign that President Trump's been associated with, even as he's uncorked in his usual improvisational and often contempt-driven way. And I think perhaps that will color this transition. Maybe then the pendulum will swing back sort of from day to day, like, well, those picks, they seem more, you can get that, right? That person's well known on Capitol Hill, and you know, Senator Rubio stands for a kind of body of thought, and you know, in historical terms, he's you know, not head turning of like, well, that makes no sense, that appointment. That makes perfect sense, and then of course. Congressman Gates, there's no precedent for such a thing. It seems to me that there's this, we're kind of bouncing between these bumpers. And with the unifying theme that President Trump's going to do exactly what he feels like on that day. And he hasn't hidden that. He's made it the basis of his campaign. The campaign was won, and so now we're going to have a transition that reflects that. And I don't think it's going to be much like either the transitions in theories. You know, as the Miller Center puts out reports about here's how transitions should work. I don't think those are going to have a lot of influence, and I don't think anybody who's trying to follow the Presidential Transition Act or whatever, he doesn't give a damn. So, and that leaves the rest of us with no choice but just to watch and see what happens and cover it conscientiously and aggressively.
Let me take a couple of those. Are all terrific themes. Let me take a couple of them and come back to Eric and Melody. So two things that John talked about. One is the president using this enormous power of the executive branch, not in support of goals of the administrative state, but in some ways of sort of tearing down the administrative state. But the second is something that's that John touches on, that you both have experience with. In these first few weeks, you're balancing personnel and policy priorities. And you're doing that at the same time. You're putting teams together that can advance policy priorities, but if people on the team have different opinions of these things, how do you know where the policies are going to end up? How do you balance those two things at the same time? Particularly since there's a bit of a switchback on this one, which is they're not carrying forward the administrative state. They're aggressively trying to tear down some particular important things in what the government has been doing. Mel, do you want to start, and then we'll go to Eric?
Sure. And you mean when you said people on the team have different impressions, are you saying, so, you know, Tulsi Gabbard, Marco Rubio, the members of the foreign policy team, for example, have different opinions.
Yeah.
So how does that manifest?
Yeah, I mean, as you think, you can either talk about the Trump administration or your own experiences. The great phrase is team of rivals, but it's not necessarily a team of rivals. Any president, including President Trump, is known to want a diversity of opinions and to watch people debate. But how do you do that when you know you have one general direction, even if you don't know exactly where you're going?
Yeah, well, and I go back to the word I used a few minutes ago around process. My husband used to always tease me, just like when I was working in the White House, about process, you know, being noun, it's a verb, it's a lot of different things. But we're constantly running a process. I mean, you know this, Eric knows this, we've experienced this. And that brings that diversity of opinions around a table after you've gone through a set of procedures, you know, with more junior people working through things, more mid-level, it gets to the senior level staff. And then lots of issues and problems have typically been worked out based on a general sense of direction as to where the president wants to go. So the president serves as a North Star. If the president doesn't serve as a North Star, then that sets a particular challenge. But the president also has assembled the team, in theory, wanting a set of experts sitting around a table who will bring differences of opinion, but are able to work through them. And by the time they have worked through them and you get to those challenges, either senior staff is deadlocked, or it's such an important issue that it needs to be presented to the president, then you're sitting around that table having that really fierce debate. And the president needing to ask important questions, tough questions, zero in on the gaps, press really hard so that ultimately he is able to make that final call. It requires a healthy debate. It requires, I think, generally a level of respect among those who are sitting around that table. It requires a level of expertise sitting around that table so that you are relying on what your colleagues are telling you, at least even if you disagree, being based in data and facts and some set of experience. And then it ultimately requires what I call good decision making. And I think whether you agree with all the decisions made by Pick Your President, the ability to make a good decision is a necessary quality in a president. So it's a balancing of the members of the senior staff ultimately being able to use the team of rivals ethos to present issues and questions to the president, and a president being able to rely on the expertise sitting at that table. And this is, why I wrote it in an essay recently. It is such a lonely position because ultimately the president has to decide based on experience, judgment, and knowledge.
Eric, I saw a lot of head nodding there while Melody was talking.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with absolutely everything that Melody just said, including and the. As a general rule of thumb, I think, you can have an extremely good process and get bad policy outcomes. You can have a bad process and sometimes get good outcomes. But if you have a bad process, the odds of getting good policy outcomes are, go down dramatically. And so I agree that process is hugely important. And I think this is one of the challenges of the Trump transition, which is it's pretty clear, going back to what President Trump has written, in The Art of the Deal back in the 1980s, that he almost has an allergy to process. He prefers to fly by the seat of his pants and thinks that's a virtue. And I think that's one reason why you saw, so much, chaotic behavior in the transition in 2016 that you mentioned, Bill, when he fired Governor Christie and Mike Rogers, who had been pulling together the transition from him, and then appointed Vice President Pence to run a transition who didn't really run a transition. And so they were kind of extemporizing, once they got into office. I think, to John's point about Susie Wiles, my impression is that the Trump people tried to organize a more orderly transition process this summer and fall out of sight of President Trump so that he wouldn't disrupt it. And that, I think the selection of Mike Waltz, whom I know well, he was in OSD policy when I was the undersecretary and then worked for Vice President Cheney on counterterrorism in Bush 43, and Senator Rubio, whose foreign policy advisory group I sat on in the 2016 campaign. These seemed like very, to John's point, very normal sort of, appointments. And then in very short order, we've had this series of appointments, Pete Hegseth to Defense, Tulsi Gabbard as Director of National Intelligence, and then Matt Gaetz as Attorney General that seem, extremely orthogonal to any kind of normal process and very much done on the fly. I mean, again, I'm relying on the reporting of John's colleagues in the Fourth Estate, but if you read the reporting, it suggests that the Hegseth nomination came together very quickly, starting at Thursday of last week, and he came in and met with Trump on Monday. The Matt Gaetz appointment, according to the reporting, was done on the flight to D.C. yesterday when President Trump was coming to meet with President Biden in the Oval and to talk with the House Republican Conference before they chose the new speaker. And it was done with Susie Wiles not being party to the decision. So I think I think we can pretty, well write finis to the notion of an orderly Trump transition this time around.
John, Eric mentioned the reporting, and there's a great line from Game of Thrones: chaos is not chaos, it's a ladder. For reporters, is chaos an opportunity? Does it, in an orderly transition with a clear process and people keeping confidential information, is that a challenge for reporters? Is the current situation kind of a field day? Lots going on, people are trying to game the situation. They turn to reporters because it's their way of playing in a chaotic situation.
Yeah, well, sure. I mean, just to emphasize, like, you know, you play the hand that you're dealt with different administrations. You don't root for a particular outcome or the failure process because that's good for us. But it is true, and there was always, in the first Trump administration, there's a paradox, like, oh, he's bashing the press, and you know, they're throwing this or that person out of the briefing room or whatever. But in fact, it was in many ways a remarkably transparent administration for two reasons. One, it's driven by his personality, which is all about the need for publicity and this kind of psychic hunger he has for both like conflict. He likes mixing up in the press, but I would also say he's got some psychic need for connection. He would really want the validation of the New York Times. And, you know, the Times colleagues talk about like how mad he was that he didn't get this or that recognition from his hometown paper. So part of it's driven by that, and then part is, probably a larger part is driven by what you suggest, that whenever you've got factions, whenever you've got a kind of decisions by improvisation as opposed to orderly process, like those are seams that you know, reporters can take advantage of because people are fighting over the narrative. They're pushing this, they're unhappy about that, and yeah, the reporters do indeed kind of exploit those divisions. So it's just fact.
And just to follow up on that, are you thinking not differently, but are you going back to muscle memory from covering the last Trump administration in that regard? Is there a different philosophy and approach in covering this administration as opposed to covering a more normal Biden administration or Obama administration or even Bush administration?
I wouldn't say that there's a different philosophy or strategic approach that my colleagues and I have tried to impose on the newsroom. We're going to do it this way is distinct from that way last time. I would say, just in my own role as a newsroom leader and how I think about the responsibilities of Politico and think about the responsibilities of journalism in this moment, I'd say there is a little bit of a shift in my own thinking. That's shaped by the experience of the last 8 years. You know, the previous occasions there was kind of an anomalous aspect to President Trump. Was his election just due to freakish circumstances? You know, big lines of inquiry of whether it was a function of illegitimate circumstances. The election was manipulated by Russia or by other foreign actors, and that colored some of the coverage, and also just the fact that this you know, kind of norm-shattering president, it was just new. We weren't used to it. It was all spectacle. As I say, this time he and the Republican Party won like a clear victory and a fairly comprehensive victory. I wouldn't say this won an overwhelming victory. You take 100 people and you move these three from that side of the room to the other, and you'd be writing about the end of Trumpism and all the rest. But the fact that it was so sustained in so many geographic areas and across so many groups, you have to reckon with that. The way I reckon with it is like we have to acknowledge that President Trump is the leader of a historical movement that has captured a particular time in the life of our government and our civic culture, and he's commanded that over the course of a decade. And like for the press, there tend to be two instincts, both of which I've found quite unsatisfactory. One is like, we're just going to get up on our high horse and what's wrong with this? People, will you look at how outrageous this is? And then, of course, lots of colleagues who adopted that pose like, well, they're kind of lonely, right? Like, wasn't that the public didn't have access to what the New York Times was writing? They just don't see the world the way you see it. And I also can't go in the other extreme. Oh, we should just reckon with this about, how out of touch we are as journalists, and we should be somehow approaching this from a position of shame or
Self-evaluation.
self-evaluation is always a good idea. Kind of lashing, self-flagellation, I don't think is. What I would rather do is approach it from a position of kind of self-confidence, and I think self-confidence has to be linked to self-discipline. We've got a job to do, and it's to cover the people, the ideas, and the decisions that they make in government. And so, to some extent, the spectacle aspect wears off. Would you believe it? He appointed Matt Gaetz to DOJ. So I would believe it. Yes. My job is not to moralize about that. It's not to assume a position of servility to that. It is to cover all the implications of that, both near-term implications. Is he going to get confirmed? And if he did, then the longer-term implications. What is he doing to he and people around him, to the institutions of government? So let's just get to work. And I find it a rather comfortable position because I've never, it's not that I have never done it or can't be prone to, but I don't particularly like riding up on a high horse. As a general rule, I don't like living in a state of peak agitation and indignation, and I don't want to do that. And there's no way I'll be in this business to adopt a servile position to this or any other president. And it's rather easy to do. We've got assets across the reporting assets, both across the government and now because of our strong European footprint across the world. So we got access to lots of people with lots of views and lots of insight, lots of knowledge, and we'll harness that. We'll do our jobs. And there's really nothing. What if they attack? Well, they attack the press every day, but what if they attack Politico? What if they kick us out of briefings? There's nothing really that he has that I really need. There'd be things like I want as much access to a president as we can get, but if somebody wants to deny that access, that doesn't limit our ability, nor does it modify our responsibilities to go cover what that president and his people are doing. So I find myself not as a citizen feeling neutral. I don't, and I doubt there's many people in this room or anywhere in the country that's neutral. We're in an age of non-neutrality. Everybody's got strong views. I'm not neutral, but from a professional point of view, I do have a measure of detachment. Let's just get to work. Let's stick the rudder in as deep as it'll go and sail to our destination. Our destination is to do our jobs on behalf of the audience.
Let me ask a quick question to each, Melody and Eric, and then I'll turn to your questions. Thank you for submitting them and keep them coming. So just on the policy priorities, Eric and Melody, what is the number one policy priority that the administration's moving forward on that you're watching most closely, if you had to pick one?
The number one, that's tough, because I see both immigration being front and center, and a series of economic issues being front and center. I think the economy was clearly a big driver, a huge driver in this election. I don't think it was the only driver. I think their security in its many facets was a big driver, along with this issue of change. And so I see those as being front and center. And I see that also mixed with something that I'll be curious to watch, which is around this issue of executive authority. And this has been an issue that's been bubbling for quite some time. Certainly the Obama years, use of executive authority, first Trump administration and Biden. And what kind of balance will there be between the White House and Congress? For quite some time, people have said, I spoke about it, elsewhere this summer, rebalancing of Congress's role vis-a-vis the President of the United States. You know, this issue of the imperial presidency, which goes back decades and decades and decades, that people feel has come to the fore. I expect that President Trump will use quite a bit of executive authority. What will or won't Congress do about it? And what might be the breaking point, or will there be one? So I think those issues and looking at that issue of executive authority will be of interest to me.
Yeah, I think it's an area that we pay a lot of attention to, and it's a great point. It's the 6th president in a row, if I have my math right, where the president has won both houses of Congress, president's party, and yet each president has issued more executive orders in the first 100 days than the president that preceded them. It's quite striking, considering you would think that they could move legislatively on things, but it doesn't necessarily guarantee it.
Right.
Eric, what are you watching? What's your number one policy issue that you're following?
Bill, I would just add to what you said. I would add to what you said is that, the 6th president who's had, a Congress of his own party, and they've all lost it pretty quickly.
Right.
And I do think, to John's earlier point, I think there's a big danger that this group is going to overinterpret its mandate. As the vote is being counted, I mean, he's going to end up winning the popular vote by probably a hair under 50%, and with a raw total somewhere in the 2-point-something million. That's going to be less than the plurality that Hillary Clinton had when she lost the Electoral College to him in 2016. And I agree with John that the breadth of this was enough that it ought to give Democrats a lot of pause about why almost every demographic group shifted directionally from Biden to Trump. But there's a real danger that they will overinterpret their mandate, and the things that they're about to do, which I don't think are going to be very popular, will maybe redound to the benefit of the opposition. So first, mass deportation, which I think they are very serious about, and which I think, combined with a few other things, the desire to purge the ranks of the senior officer corps of the military, I think could pitch us into a kind of civil military crisis, and both an institutional and a constitutional crisis very quickly. There's discussion about declaring a state of emergency to be able to tap DoD resources to both build the wall, but also to provide the infrastructure, allowing U.S. military bases to be places where, quote, illegal immigrants are going to be, rounded up and held. I mean, the infrastructure for mass deportation does not exist right now. And if they tap the military to do this, that's going to, bring on all sorts of issues. And if you add to that this brooded board that is going to weed out, generals who've been supportive of DEI. I mean, Pete Hegseth has said flat out that he's going to fire C.Q. Brown, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, because Hegseth sees him as a diversity hire, which, by the way, is absurd. I mean, I know General Brown, quite well, and he is an incredibly thoughtful, able military leader. It'll be a tragedy for the country if that happens. So I think, that is something I think people really need to keep an eye on. I think tariffs are not just going to be part of trade policy. They're going to be part of the budget, because they seriously think that they can fund the federal government with tariffs that they can use to offset big tax cuts that they're going to provide. We haven't funded the federal government that way since the early part of the 20th century. And that's going to bring all sorts of, second and third order consequences. The other thing I think is going to be Ukraine. And President Trump has said he's going to appoint a peace envoy. I mean, from the sound of what I'm hearing from the transition, it's really more a surrender envoy. And that may end up being wrapped together with a Lebanon ceasefire somehow. I mean, Prime Minister Netanyahu's Minister of Strategic Affairs, Ron Dermer, has been down to Mar-a-Lago. He's been talking with the Biden administration. There is a potential that, and he was in Moscow seeking Russian acquiescence in that. There's a possibility here that they try and make a kind of big geopolitical play with a Lebanon ceasefire tied to a Ukraine, what I would describe as a sellout. And so those are the things I'm keeping my eye on.
All right, so we have terrific questions from the audience. We'll do sort of lightning round, 1 minute on each of these if we can, and I think we'll get 3 different clusters of questions here. So first, Melody, to a point that you said, if we agree that this election reveals anxiety of the American working class, that's one dimension, both economic and security anxiety, how is this being addressed right now in the transition? Are you seeing them focusing on working class issues as they're putting their team together?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, the nominees or appointees have been coming with greater speed. It'll be interesting to see what today brings. I mean, we're looking for a Treasury Secretary. We'll see, looking for a head of the National Economic Council. So there's some of those big positions, U.S. Trade Representative. So some of those big positions to come. I think that they haven't been named yet is not a reflection on the fact that these won't be significant issues and leading issues, and for the reasons that Eric touched on. I mean, the tariff issue that's real. I mean, I think they will lean hard into that, and there were also other issues that were discussed or described as campaign promises, and I think the president-elect will try to execute on as many of his campaign promises as he possibly can, inside of the process that we've described earlier.
John, a bunch of questions for you. Bill, could I just
please
add one thing? Because of my list of other issues, the immigration issue, there's also potential, obviously, for crisis with Mexico that I think would be compounded by the potential that the president will kind of give President Sheinbaum a kind of ultimatum about the cartels and fentanyl. And if you look at the statements Mike Waltz has made and some legislation he's introduced, they are talking about potential military strikes, in Mexico on cartels. So that is also in the offing potentially early on.
John, a series of questions to you. Is Politico preparing for attacks by the Trump administration on its ability to report? But also, one of our audience members, viewers, says that characterizing the incoming administration as contempt-driven may be putting an editorial slant, basically, as the summary here. Does the press have a responsibility to regulate the tone of democratic debate? And then also, what's the most effective way to change the narrative about how the political coalitions come together in the country? Are you seeing a narrative developed about what each political coalition, the one that Trump won and the one that Democrats thought they had put together to win?
Sort of quickly, how we prepare to it. I'm really trying to do it covered as I would any administration, which is, we've sort of touched on it. Like, what are the big, the big decisions that we think are in the offing, and what are the different seams, ideological seams, partisan seams, personal rivalries, and so what's our angle of attack? Is really the way I look at it, and I'm not looking at it as like, well, what if they knock on the door and try to start tossing our reporters in jail? I just don't have reason to believe that that's, and I try to avoid being too kind of self-dramatic or heroic about it. When you have people around the world, actually reporters, they are getting tossed in jail or executed or have their families intimidated, I really am wary of being like overly self-righteous in this country with all our challenges to make it think that we're as reporters are facing these insurmountable burdens as we travel from green room to green room, or network to network or whatever. We've got serious jobs to do, but I don't feel that we're endangered in that way. With respect to my contempt, I did want to emphasize, and I think I did at the beginning, I'm really not making a statement of my feeling. I do think that's an accurate description of the politics when you have, I don't know that would Congressman Gates say, look, actually, I'm not driven by contempt, I'm driven by respect. It is a politics of contempt, and it works both ways, actually. I think part of the strength of President Trump's movement is his people. It's not just that they like everything he does. They love the fact that it causes Nancy Pelosi or the New York Times or right-thinking people generally, or at least they would think of themselves as right-thinking people. It causes them to be contemptuous, and that's what drives the cycle. I back President Trump precisely because of his enemies or perceived enemies, and that's what I mean. I do think it is it's what I've in some contexts called the contempt paradox. Like contemptuous actions inspire more contempt, and in fact advance his purposes. That's why my view is let's get away from the sort of contemptuous media coverage and really just, certainly not servile media coverage, just actually cover decisions and their consequences. And then there's one other I'll get real quick, which was the political coalition. Oh, the political coalition, whatever, that anybody here would have as good a view on that as I do. The reason I'm actually in a kind of an exhilarated mood about the 4 years ahead, it's not uniformly held in my household, I should point out. But I am kind of up. We've got enormous definitional moments between the United States and Europe. Between the United States and other parts of the world, and most particularly what the approach to China is going to be. This is a moment of huge fluidity and transition. Domestically, both parties, the Democrats right away have to have a definitional argument based on their diagnosis of what went wrong and what different remedies are, and you've already got really interesting divisions in that. Ideological divisions, tactical divisions, to some degree generational divisions. Republicans don't have it yet, but the latest they'll have it is 2 years from now, probably have it before then, as people are jostling what does the Republican Party stand for. So that's why politics is interesting. There's always a kind of a new thing, or people fighting to define the new thing, or make themselves and their ideas the new thing. So anyway, I don't know what the new coalitions will be, but I can guarantee there will be. Nothing is static about politics.
So, yeah, please.
Just on this issue, because I think it is one of the most interesting issues and questions that emerges from this election. And one of the things that I find striking about it is that now everyone is in play. Because, and I've been in the halls of Congress after people have won and lost, and there's always we didn't pay enough attention to that group, or we didn't focus enough on that group. Now you've got to focus on everybody. And I think that is an important moment for us as a democracy. I think it is also important because this has complicated the way that people look at these issues, particularly as a matter of demography, and try to pigeonhole people in particular places. And I think it requires everyone to look at why people made the choices that they made and what that means, and do it in a far more nuanced way than we typically have before. And I think it is an important moment for this country to engage in these questions and observations in order for us to move forward. My political background is no mystery. Where I wish the elections had landed, I don't think anyone will be surprised. As someone who works on democracy issues, I think that this is really important and potentially could be transformative. It is a moment of peril. It potentially could be a moment of promise if, in fact, we scratch on it and dig hard enough and do a deep dive into it.
On that inspiring note, we're going to go a few minutes longer because we started a few minutes late, and I'm going to bring it back to what I hope is not an eyes glaze over question, but a lot of questions about process, very Miller Center audience focused. So one goes to a few things several people have said. If the panelists could elaborate a bit more on process, but does having a strict process limit innovation and the disruption needed to for the United States to compete against our new adversaries like China? So is disruption an opportunity to do things differently? How does compliance with the ethics provisions prevent the process from moving forward? And one important piece of process that we haven't touched on, or maybe touched on very lightly with respect to Matt Gaetz, but what is the chance of no congressional vote of appointees using the recess appointment? Do we think do we think President Trump and his team is going to be successful in getting a lot of his nominees through without having a vote? Eric, do you want to jump in on any of those?
Well, let me take on maybe two pieces of it. One, having just co-chaired a congressionally chartered commission that reported out about the need to radically reform the Department of Defense and encourage innovation in order to be able to successfully compete with our adversaries. I understand the point of the questioner. The problem is, how do you strike the right balance between disruptive change and ongoing governance? And I think, for instance, removing General Brown, who actually is thinking very hard about precisely these problems and how to move the Pentagon, which is enormous, complicated bureaucracy, in the right directions, while at the same time engaging in all the different missions that we've got them engaged in, whether it's in Ukraine or in the Middle East or in the Indo-Pacific. This can be terribly disruptive at a period of time when, as our commission argued, we're facing arguably the most complex and dangerous international security situation since 1945. So, on that point. On the, recess appointment issue, I think they're deadly serious about using Article 2, Section 3. And this will be a real test of how much Senate Republicans are going to stand up for institutional prerogatives and the checks and balances that, the Constitution created. And I hope they stand up for the Constitution and for the appropriate checks and balances. I mean, the one through line of the appointments so far, and there's been some reporting on this, that the transition set up this war room in Mar-a-Lago with big multiple screens and showing President Trump, video montages of people making television appearances on Fox, CNN, and MSNBC, et cetera. And the through line of all these appointments, is how well you defend Donald Trump on TV. And so I think that is something that we need to watch as this goes forward in terms of the process. And final point, the unwillingness to sign the ethics pledges that are required under the Presidential Transition Act is very worrisome to me, particularly since you've now got this Department of Government Efficiency that's being created, which is not going to be a department because that would require congressional legislation. According to the people in transition, it's not going to be in the White House. It's going to be off the books somewhere, which raises the issue of how it's going to be funded. Is it going to be funded by private funds? And with Vivek Ramaswamy and Elon Musk, the potential, is enormous for self-dealing and for crony capitalism. And, I think, you can obviously just, think out loud about the fleet vehicle requirements for the Department of Defense, which are enormous, which are suddenly going to be, they've got to be, electric vehicles, white, made in the United States of America. And Elon Musk's, net worth goes up by another, $15, $20 billion.
Mel, what does a good process look like? And then you've also worked on Capitol Hill in the Senate and the Senate Judiciary Committee. How does that process extend to confirmations?
Sure. So a good process, and going to this question about does it encourage or does it stifle innovation, a good process actually makes room for lots of voices and innovation. It ensures that the most senior people, the people who when they walk in the room are the people who sit at the table and everyone else either is not in the room or sitting around the wall, that those voices that are around the wall and not in the room at that particular moment in time are heard. And because it's naturally built into a good process. I saw that over and over and over again. And that's the place where you get a different way of thinking, a different idea that may not be, one that's coming from the most senior person that's at the table. And I often saw President Obama look beyond those of us who were seated at the table and point to people at the wall and say, well, what do you think? Process, just because it sounds orderly and a little staid, doesn't mean that you're breaking the back of innovation. It means when it's well done that you are actually encouraging it. From my standpoint, and I'm going quickly because I recognize that we're a little bit over, my point of view, having worked on the Senate Judiciary Committee and constantly looking at, and been obviously on both sides, but looking at those words in the Constitution, advice and consent. And ultimately, for a person to have the authority they need and to be seen with the legitimacy that you want someone sitting in those offices to have, they need to have gone through that process. I mean, by virtue of the way that they're constructed, recess appointments are temporary. When you go out sine die, those recess appointments, there are all kinds of nuances to Senate procedure, but as a general matter, those appointments are over. And that's not what you want from a standpoint of continuity of government or for the person sitting in that seat or the person sitting in the department or agency that has to listen to and report to that person if you want some kind of consistency. It also raises a question about how the chief executive, how President-elect Trump is thinking about his relationship with the Senate, and if in fact this is a dare early on. Will you buck me on this when you walk into office and you have, not huge majorities, but you've got a majority and you now have the rule in the Senate, or not have the rule in the Senate with regard to filibusters on nominations. So a simple majority will get your nominees through. What's going on that you start out raising the specter of recess appointments from day one after an election that has so many in your party so excited that they now have power?
John, a final closing thought for us to bring this home?
Melody and Secretary Edelman both stimulated a couple of just quick observations. One, I do wonder how much method is behind this. There's, to me, a great temptation to think, oh, Trump is off the rails. He doesn't know what he's doing. And I actually think there's usually quite a lot of purpose behind what he's doing and what he's saying. In this case, I've wondered whether the purpose is he's going to give them some that he knows that Republicans are going to say no to. That's going to be a hard vote, and therefore he'll effectively have an open pathway for others that might otherwise be incredibly controversial. So maybe Congressman Gates won't get it, but then we said no to him, I've got to say yes to these others. I just wonder that. I don't know that to be the case. The other thing, with respect to how the senators are going to protect their institutional prerogatives, I would say their institutional responsibilities, I think it's going to be clarifying. There's got to be a certain number of, I would think, senators who are might say to hell with it, or if they're thinking about saying it's time for me to go, does that give them freedom? I would take somebody like Senator Tillis. Incidentally, we don't really know what his future is. He might say, you know what, I'm not going to seek re-election, and I am going to stay here and say what I really think on these nominees. So I think you might look at this process to judge the sort of different political and generational decisions that individual senators are making. And then above all, I think we look at it in terms of the evolution of the Senate as a body and whether people are willing to protect it and I would say vindicate it, or they're just going to acquiesce on partisan grounds. If so, that's a profound change.
Well, I want to thank our three panelists and all of you. Eric, John, and Melody, we really are just so lucky to have you as part of our community here. Your depth of knowledge, expertise, your insights, and also the joy that you bring to our work together. And to all of you, thank you so much for coming. It's great to see a full house for this very important event. We will be doing more of these. We will do at least one more event in this room on the transition in the new year, right before inauguration. We're actually doing an event next week in DC. In partnership with the Brookings Institution, continuing to drill down on a number of these themes. And I think we're going to do a series of roundtable discussions around different policy issues that are getting played out, both in real time, but also looking back in history, what previous transition moments, not just the narrow 11 weeks, 77 days between Election Day and Inauguration Day look like, but more broadly, what have been some of the bigger other shifts that we've seen when new presidents are elected. So with that, thank you all, and look forward to seeing you again soon.